Coming up on this week's show, Rare's lost Game Boy Challenger is found.
Japan declares war on the floppy disk.
And we chat with Michael Case about bringing Metal Gear Solid and Oddworld to the PC.
And the Retro Hour podcast is brought to you every single Friday with our amazing friends at Bitmap Books. Now, one of their books you should absolutely check out, the unofficial SNES Pixel book, created in collaboration with German publisher Elektrospieler. This lavish 272-page volume celebrates the golden age of 16-bit gaming on Nintendo's popular home console. We'll tell you more about that in just a bit, but you can check out that book and the rest of their retro collection at bitmapbooks.com. Hello and welcome to the Retro Hour podcast, episode number 343, your weekly dose of retro gaming and technology news with me, Dan Wood.
Me, Ravi Abbott.
And me, Joe Fox.
And a very warm welcome to this week's show, of course, the podcast that every week does a fair bit of reminiscing. We get all nostalgic on you, taking you back to the classic age of video games and keeping you up to date on everything that's happening in the retro scene in 2022, which I did have someone tell me the other week, actually, that, you know, it's kind of an industry now, isn't it, retro gaming? It is so big. I mean, you walk into WH Smith and the amount of retro magazines, many of which Ravi's actually involved with, you see on the shelves in there these days. It's just nuts how big retro gaming's become.
I think it's the big players. The big players have actually taken notice. And when we first started this podcast, there were lots of small companies and there were lots of people doing, you know, small stuff. But like companies like Limited Run Games are huge now. And, you know, you've got the mini consoles coming out. And there's been a real change where retro has actually been embraced by the wider world.
And I think it's seen as a bit of a saviour by some companies as well. Like, you know, maybe their current stuff's not doing all that well. It's like, oh, let's celebrate the stuff we used to do back in the day. Everyone's into that stuff again. So that's what we do. We celebrate all that on this podcast every single Friday. And I think my favourite bit of this podcast, as much as I love chatting to you guys, but it's when we get a veteran on to tell their story about their time in the games industry in the second half of the show. And we've got an incredible guest on this week's podcast.
Yeah, me and Ravi interviewed Michael Case, who actually was the head of Digital Dialect back in the 90s and the 2000s, but we kind of spoke about his whole career as we do, which was really interesting to say the least, wasn't it, Ravi? How he got into the industry was really quite a fun story. And then it was a very odd entry to the industry. You know, these are some of these naughty 2600 games that came out back then. And then he kind of went into a really mad route. So he went into like the military. There was some parts about like missiles and stuff like that. But also something I found really interesting, which was Androbot, which was a machine created as a topo machine, which was basically a giant robot. And it was founded in 1983 by a company that Nolan Bushnell ran. And these were like early robots that would kind of communicate with like barcode scanners and stuff, and you'd be able to play with them. But the actual main Topobot was huge, and Androbot was like a smaller version of this, but it was actually called Androbot Inc. And, you know, we've not really mentioned this before. Everybody talks about Rob, the robot, you know, that came out for the NES, but it was great to hear about that. And then later on, he went into converting games for the PC. And this is stuff like, I can never say it, what is it, Battle Arena to Shinden, which was even released on MS-DOS. And then later on, he went into some of the biggest titles in the PlayStation world, like Oddworld and Metal Gear Solid. Yeah, and it was really thought-provoking. I don't want to ruin it too much. I think I say that whenever I do an interview, but he went into explaining about how, like, you know, you have to kind of test all these different kind of like, not just test all the different kind of computers, but different kind of setups. And when they did the Metal Gear Solid one, they had like over 400 PC setups to see if they could crash the game and stuff like that, you know, to make sure that it run on everybody's different kind of like potential setup that might be out there, which I thought was really thought-provoking. I was like, I've never thought about that before when porting a console game to PC, that there could be all these thousands of different like graphic cards and setups and stuff like that they have to consider that. So it was a really, really interesting discussion.
Yeah, you make a game for the PlayStation, you know everyone's got the exact same hardware.
Yeah.
I guess it's a lot of, it's some
But then when you're porting the likes of Metal Gear Solid and Oddworld, you know, the biggest PlayStation games of the time in like 97, 98 and the early 2000s and stuff, you got to think like, okay, they're going to sell millions of these games to the PC. They got to make sure it works. So that was really, really interesting.
Yeah, you suddenly get people going, my sound's not working, and that's a lot of refunds to give out, I imagine, isn't it? Especially back then when you couldn't patch it.
All the resolutions as well that you have to go into, and different effects. Are they going to work on the certain graphics cards, and how people are rendering it? It's quite interesting, actually. You know, people with these consoles, you don't know how lucky they are for developers just to have that kind of one set out, system that everybody knows.
Yeah, so looking forward to this one. Michael Case is going to be our special guest on the show in around half an hour from now. Now, of course, before that, we give you a little roundup of what's been happening in the world of retro from over the last 7 days. And I always like it when we see news stories that follow on nicely from recent interviews that we did. Now, you might remember, we've had him on the show actually a couple of times in the last few months, Paul Makacek from Rare, who we were out in Norway with last month doing a few panels and went out for a few drinks with him. Lovely guy. But also we did an episode before that about his work on the Game Boy. And he mentioned to you guys when he did that interview that Rare actually made their own competitor to the Game Boy that was never released back in the day. Turns out this thing was titled The Playboy. And funnily enough, a couple of weeks after he did that interview, one of these prototypes has actually surfaced.
Yeah, so I'd never heard of this before. He has actually spoke about it previously on Twitter and with Red Bull, via Red Bull. He's actually discussed this in 2016. But yeah, long story short, the Raz arcade board, which is what Rare used to make their games, essentially he was kind of like, Paul was asked to see if he could get this into a handheld. So he essentially he managed to do it. You know, go listen to the episode if you want to hear about how he did that and everything. I'm not a technical guy, but he got it into a handheld. And, you know, the way he described the Playboy, which he then took over to, what was the name of the event? It was before E3. What was it? The computer...
CES, was it?
CES, yeah. He took it to CES. The way he described it, I was expecting like an exposed circuit board, like with a screen hanging off it and stuff like that. But it wasn't. It looks really cool, from the news article where it's been surfaced. And essentially they took it to show to Nintendo, look what we've made. And Nintendo, the story goes, revealed the Game Boy. So he kind of went, oh, well, we won't show them the Playboy then. But yeah, it went missing for a very long time, and it's surfaced. They've found one of the original prototypes, and it's very kindly been put on display at the Retro Computer Museum in Leicester, which is really cool. They haven't said where they found it, so I was under the impression that the Retro Computer Museum was just like, oh, we've got it, we found it, but it was actually the guys at Rare that have found it.
A guy called Pete Cox, apparently.
Yeah, Pete Cox has found it, and he's also given, it's not in working condition, but apparently it was actually, Paul goes on to say that, you know, that it was very powerful because it was made off an arcade board. It was more powerful than the NES. The graphics were better than the NES. So I have a guess that it was more powerful than the Game Boy. It ran off 6 AA batteries.
I wonder how long they would have lasted in like a miniaturized arcade board.
It's quite a beefy looking handheld, but it does have 4 buttons rather than the classic, 2 buttons on the Game Boy, which I think is pretty cool. But yeah, it's not in working condition, but they have given them permission to have a little tinker with it and see if they can get it in working condition. Nice. But currently on display, which I think is really cool. And, it's kind of to see that like parallel universe of what we could have had, if the Game Boy didn't come out.
I've got to say, I remember friends of mine, back in the 90s when combat trousers were pretty popular, weren't they? I remember having like Game Boys in, the front pockets and stuff like that. This boy looks a bit chunkier than a Game Boy. I've got to say the Playboy looks like it probably wouldn't fit in your pocket. In your combat trousers. Yeah, it's got like a bit of a curve to it. It's like, imagine the Game Boy, but then it's like, it's the size of the Game Boy, kind of like where the buttons are, but then the screen is kind of like on a curve on top of it, isn't it? It looks to me like it's made to play on a table, kind of the angle of the screen looking up at you. Because if you're holding it, actually the screen's kind of pointing down at your chest, isn't it? Yeah, you would kind of have to hold it kind of like flat, and then the screen would like look up at you, wouldn't it? Which is quite an interesting design. But, I think it looks, considering it's a prototype, I think it looks quite complete. Yeah, and you've got a start and select button on there. You've got like a D-pad and two fire buttons by the looks of it.
I think it's great that it's at the Retro Computer Museum, Leicester. I couldn't think of a better place for it to get fixed and repaired. They've got the CD 1200 there that they need to fix now. They've got the Playboy as well. So Andy Davidson and the crew, they're absolutely awesome, because I think if it went to other museums or it went to places, it would probably be behind a glass cabinet. It probably is now, but you talk to Andy and the guys and they'll take it out and let you have a look and stuff. And that's what I kind of love about that place. It's really good. You should visit it. It's essentially like a giant kid's bedroom. That's how I've always seen the Retro Computer Museum in Leicester.
Yeah, we haven't been over for a while, I think. Yeah, definitely a visit is due before the end of the year. And if you get yourself along to the Retro Computer Museum in Leicester, you can get a look at Rare's Lost Prototype. They're a challenger to the Game Boy, the Playboy. I could imagine many parents being pleased with their kids owning something called that, though.
You need to go in and say, can I have a look at your Playboy?
Yeah. Now, this is very cool. Now, I must admit, I've always liked the idea of playing flight simulators. I just think I'm a bit too... I was going to say a bit too thick. Maybe that is the case. I haven't got the attention span to learn a flight simulator. And I was always that way as a kid. I mean, I remember, obviously, microprose, they were kind of the king, particularly on the Amiga and the PC, of flight sims. And I remember getting cover disc demos of stuff like F-19 Stealth Fighter and F-15 Strike Eagle. And, occasionally I'd jab away at the keyboard and figure out how to take off. And that was probably about as far as they ever got with them. But it turns out now that microprose are actually kind of going back to roots. And they're bringing out a new game which is called Tiny Combat Arena. And this is a throwback to those flight sims that they made back in the 90s by the looks of it.
Well, you guys interviewed Wild Bill Steely on this. And, he came from that military flight background. And, he had some great stories of... the past and like flight simulators. And you're right, Microprose, they released some absolutely awesome ones. Gunship and Gunship 2000 were ones that I remember. This game looks really interesting actually, because thinking about it, flight simulators, when they get re-released and stuff nowadays, they're higher res graphics. Like Microsoft Flight Simulator is just amazing graphics, and it's really done up and stuff. This is actually
massive.
Massive, yeah. This is actually done in a retro style, and I must say, the look of it looks really like Microprose, but they've got that kind of modern crispness to it, and like shader detail.
It's the retro look, but it's a lot of these modern retro looking games are doing this style at the moment. What's that Goose game called? It's called literally just like Goose Game. I can't remember what it's called.
Yeah, that's
Untitled
it.
Goose Game.
Untitled Goose Game. That's it. Like, it's got the same look as that. That's what it reminds me of. Obviously, it plays completely different. It's not, the game itself is nothing like it, but that really simplistic, like
stylized
graphics, and it looks a lot more approachable.
Well, these are the graphics we're used to, but the frames per second we're not used to. Like, I used to remember playing a lot of flight simulators on the Amiga. I'd have to stop at points because I'd feel sick because of the frame rate. Some would be really low, and like just simulating a fight or doing dogfighting and stuff in there was really tough. But this looks absolutely awesome, and I can't wait to kind of pick it up and play it at a decent frame rate finally.
I think it's cool as well, the fact that you've got those kind of old school graphics, but obviously it's going to be, I imagine, 1080p at least, or maybe even 4K. Looking at it, and I always like the idea of flight sims. I mean, when I was a kid, I was really into planes. I still quite like, quite find aviation quite interesting. But I remember when I was like 7-8 years old, I really wanted to be a plane pilot. And I think, I've always liked the idea of playing flight sims, but it's, they're just, I don't know, just seem a bit too complicated sometimes for their own good. When you used to get them back in the day, I had friends that were into flight sims, and they'd open the game box, and it'd be like a copy of the Yellow Pages falling out, the manual. I'd look at it, I'd be like, I'll go back to play Sonic for a bit.
Well, I kind of like the idea of sitting in a huge flight simulator, which is accurate with the displays and stuff like that. That would be quite cool. I used to remember going to like the fair, and there'd be these giant simulators that you get in and sit on and stuff. That was a thing in the 90s. You don't see them nowadays, do you? Like a huge simulator, and it would like go up and down and chuck you around.
Well, they used to make me feel sick. Yeah. After like 6 of the those sugar donuts and a bag of candy floss going in there.
I was about to say a bag of candy floss as well.
But yeah, I think this looks awesome, and like this is one for the real kind of accurate flight simulator peeps. It's got like a database with statistics, and it has the aircraft, vehicles, and weapons, and like all the different approaches to a tactical situation and stuff. And these games have always been about really learning it and getting into it. And I can imagine if you're a pilot, this might be even fun to do your spare time off.
Yeah, you work 12 hours in the air, then come home and play this all night.
Well, you can't go around shooting everyone, can you?
And it's affordable as well. It's only going to be £15.49, so you can pre-order that on Steam right now. It does look very good, actually. I think if you're a fan of those Microprose games back in the day, this is going to be very nostalgic. And I think if you loved all those classic flight sims, it's going to be something you're going to find really interesting.
I was expecting them to come out with something a bit bigger and something a bit wower, but actually, I quite like this because it's directly on their roots. It looks like an indie game. It's cheap. That's a good way to start and build up from that, with Microprose coming back. I think that's a really good way to do it, and to look back and especially have that look and feel of the older games. Don't just come out there with a huge new, right, this is the new Microprose and, ridiculous graphics and not much kind of thought to it. This is a well thought out release.
Now, we've been reading about all these headlines, and about you guys. I keep seeing artificial intelligence image generators and making the headlines everywhere at the moment. And we've been playing around with, services like DALL-E, stuff like that. I even heard a headline the other day that there's been this big art contest, and actually the winning image, it turned out, was AI generated. And a lot of people have been
that. Caused a lot of controversy. And there's also this out of image thing now, which is really weird, which is you have an image, and then the AI, like, Mona Lisa or a classic painting will draw what's going on outside of that image. So we'll kind of continue the room and the landscape based on the image, which is just weird. It's getting scarily intelligent, isn't it? AI. Like before we were all like, AI, it's all right. But now it can start to do images and stuff. It's like, oh, wow, it's got a mind.
I, for one, welcome our new artistic overlords, especially if they're doing stuff like this, because it turns out that, while all these other AI services are trying to get, photorealism, this one's really cool. Image to image is actually doing MS-DOS style pixel art.
Yeah, this is one that I've not seen before, and it's called image to image. So it takes an input image and it applies with a text prompt. I've used DALL-E, a mini DALL-E, where you type in a text prompt. I think mine was Limp Bizkit Wedding, and that was quite funny. But there was another one.
Elon Musk eating crayons, I remember you did as well.
Yeah, Darth Vader in the bathtub as well. That was another one. But this one seems to take like an image source and then combine it with another one as well and use the text prompts. But they've been doing it with some classic MS-DOS images, and it's like portraits of Duke Nukem, Secret of Monkey Island, King's Quest, Star Control, and there's a bit of editing and a bit of changes going on in this, but they look like real versions of the actual games. And
so I've got this the wrong way around. Originally, I thought it was making MS-DOS style images, but it's not. It's actually turning old school pixel art into photorealistic images. Then.
Yes,
yeah.
Right, got you.
I thought when Ravi first sent this over, it was people just reenacting it. I was like, that's hardly a news story, because it looks that good.
But no, it looks that good. Yeah,
it looks that good. It's insane. I do find it interesting that I don't know what the game is, but the kid holding the laser cannon.
That's Commander Keen.
It doesn't quite know what a laser cannon is, so it looks like it's giving him like some photography equipment, which I think is really funny.
I thought it was a drinking flask.
Maybe some sort of drinking flask.
This seems to be more of a high-end one. So image to image has been used recently. There's a Reddit thread on it to upgrade children's drawings. So, children's drawings and then doing like a high-end, like photorealistic version of what that would become. I can imagine there's going to be some scary versions of this. And like, you look at that Commander Keen image here and the kid looks a bit weird, doesn't he? He looks a bit Benjamin Button, kind of like an adult child. Yeah, it's interesting, but it is quite shocking how good it gets. And we're definitely going to have a scary future. But just imagine what games you'd like to see recreated photorealistically in AI.
There are some that I wouldn't want to see. I mean, what about stuff like The Witch of Granny's Garden?
I knew
What they
you
make
were
her look
going to
like.
say that. That's like
Still
your
the
ultimate
scariest,
nightmare.
the scariest video game character, or like Nemesis from like Resident Evil.
Zool. Imagine what Zool would look like, or one of the worms. Oh, that would be weird.
The aliens from Alien. How would it make those look in like photorealism?
Oh God, yeah. That would be.
I just feel like you're saying all these things, and I'm like, well, worms would look like a worm, I imagine. And then I'm like, the aliens would look like the ones from the films. I don't know, but yeah, I can't get like the Duke Nukem one. How good that one looks. That one's like mind-boggling. Like, it is scary.
It's when they can get to the stage where, and I've seen people arguing over this, because I think there was actually a big like newspaper actually couldn't get an image of somebody, so it used like DALL-E, the AI service, to actually make its image for the article.
Oh wow!
And a lot of people have been kicking off when it's putting photographers out of business, that kind of thing. I'm looking here, that Duke Nukem one, for example, where he looks like a real person. Maybe in like 10 years when, or maybe even sooner, if it can animate these, then you could potentially make kind of a full movie.
That's the deep fakes, and that's where it all starts to get kind of scary. Like, you could just get the guys from the Retro Hour and put us in a video game. Or really weird. Yeah, I'm not going to encourage that.
Well, they got here. I mean, there's Guybrush Threepwood in a Lane from Monkey Island, and that's turned into a real image. And yeah, I'm looking at that, and I think you could at least do maybe a kind of a 10-minute short story using those characters if you animate them properly. And I see it come up all the time on like Facebook and stuff like that. There's one today. I got an advert from a woman, who's like, just looked like a sales pitch. Then she mentioned that she doesn't exist. She's like an AI generated character. Then it turns into like a wireframe, but it looked photorealistic. So it's like, for the movie industry and even video games, that they can make games using this technology. I imagine there've got to be a lot of artists out there who are probably a bit angry at this and a bit worried, I imagine.
Maybe, yeah. Like, imagine how easy it would be to do like a photorealistic reboot of like an old title. Just get something and then all process it. Like we've even seen the guy who's redoing Hit and Run at the moment with upscaling some of the graphics as well, just on the fly, and that's just one guy doing it on his own. I can't imagine what a film industry professional or someone would be able to do. I can't wait to see Syndicate done in.
Well, it'd be like, when Toy Story came out and that was like a benchmark for being the first CGI completely generated movie, the fact that, 2 or 3 decades later we're getting stuff like this. Although I am looking, the more I look at that Commander Keen picture, the last one of the article, the more I'm thinking this was a mistake. This technology shouldn't have been invented. That is horrifying.
Yeah, it's kind of horrifying. You see what I mean with Benjamin Button? It kind of looks. Yeah.
So it's quite interesting though that you can turn your own old pixel art games into photorealistic images. So if you want to read more about that, I'll link up the article on Ars Technica in our show notes, and everything else we talk about, you'll find it in there. Now, Japan have declared war on the floppy disk, and there is a new version of the Evercade coming out. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Before we do though, of course we have a patron that really helps us out. And the reason that you might want to back us on Patreon is obviously to keep this podcast coming out every week, but also we give you some nice little perks in return, which Joe will detail now.
I was going to say, is this where I chime in? Yeah, no, absolutely. Like, I always say this, but we massively, massively appreciate the fact that people essentially kept the Retro Hour going through the lockdown, all those years ago now. Feels like so many years ago. But not only kept it going and was able for us to, do our home studios and work separately and stuff like that, have kept it going as well and then kept it independent. And obviously, you don't just keep the Retro Hour going. We do like to give back. We do the show ad-free. You get access to our Discord. But my favourite part is also access to our After Hours extra podcast, where we do all sorts on that. We've been reviewing video game years. We've been doing our top 5 consoles and top 5 games, particular consoles, and we also do some reviews from our own point of views as well, which is we've just done one where we actually reviewed some games that people suggested to us in Discord, and then my absolute favorite as well is we do the end of the month hangout where people can come along and hang out with us. I was going to say over the phone then, that's really retro.
We should do that, like a retro
conference call. Is everybody on the call? No, we do that online, which is like a real virtual users group where we all just get together and we have a drink, and it's just, you know, I always say it to my wife, like when we do the retro hour hangout, I'm like, you know, I'm on with the crew, you know. But yeah, no, I absolutely love it, and it still blows my mind that, you know, we're 7 years in to the retro hour now almost, and we've been doing the Patreon for a couple of years, you know, just before lockdown happened, and the fact that people support us in that way,
especially at the moment, I think, because we know that, you know, costs are going up and everything, and you know, we appreciate whether not everyone can support us on Patreon, but for, you know, if you can find it, just, you know, it can be as low as, like, I think our lowest one's like $3 a month, and it does make a huge difference. It just means that we can keep putting the show out every week. I mean, I don't want to go into the amount of work we do on it, but I mean, doing this podcast, it can be a full-time job sometimes, and you know, we've done it every week now for 7 years, and we'd like to do it for another 7, and your support really makes that possible. And of course, like Joe said, I mean, you get the normal episode early most weeks, you get it ad-free. We do about 15 minutes of extra news stories for our patrons on an exclusive edition each week as well. So if you want to get access to all that and join us for this month's hangout that is coming up in a couple of weeks' time, all the details to back us on Patreon, you'll find it at theretrohour.com. And of course, for joining the Retro Hour Patreon community, you will get a mention in the most prestigious high score table in the world of retro gaming, and that is the Retro Hour Hall of Fame.
Hall of Fame!
And I'll let Joe give a shout to our latest patron.
A massive, massive, massive thank you to Luke Chalice.
Thank you so much to Luke for joining the community. And if you'd like to do the same, everything you need to know to get involved in our Patreon is at theretrohour.com. Right then, our special interview with Michael Case coming up on the show in just a minute. I've got to admit, you know, I love my Nintendo Switch as a handheld system. When I'm not playing that, though, my other favourite handheld would probably be my Evercade. You guys played on an Evercade before?
I very briefly played your Evercade last time I came over, which was a while ago now. I think it was around this time last year.
I've never played one before, but I'm actually amazed with how successful it's been. And, you know, they spotted a gap in the market, which was people wanting these kind of pre-compiled collections that are really cool, instead of having these endless lists of doom scrolling through ROMs, you know. And I think they've done really well, actually. I know loads of people with Evercades that just absolutely love them and get into that kind of collector vibe with it as well.
Yeah, you're right, because I mean, you actually get physical cartridges on them. And there are some great packs. I've got, like, you know, the Codemasters collection, the Atari Lynx collection, the Namco Museum, Bitmap Brothers one I think I've got as well. And it's really nice. It reminds me, because they're offline systems. They're nice and portable. They remind me of playing, like, you know, what you imagine in your memory playing a Lynx or a Game Gear was like. Only, you know, when you go back to the Lynx and you see the display.
It reminds me, you know, when I was a kid and you go to, like, Spain or whatever, you'd see these, like, 50-in-1 cartridges for the Game Boy, and they never worked properly. And, you know, there wasn't actually 50 games on it. There'd be, like, 5 games just repeated on it.
Just repeated, yeah.
They remind me of what I wished they were when I was a kid. Like, they are actually them. They work, you know, they're actual games working properly on a really nice, you know, handheld device. But there's an even nicer one coming out, isn't there, Dan?
Yeah, well, I mean, they released the Evercade VS, or the Evercade Versus, back end of last year, I think it was. We talked about that. That was kind of the physical console that you hook up to your TV.
That was 2-player, wasn't it?
Yeah,
that was
the first one we could have 2 players. Yeah. But kind of, you know, in the vein of what Nintendo did with the Switch, you know, upgrading it to a nicer screen and everything, they've actually got a new version of this called the Evercade EXP. Now, this gives you a nice high-resolution IPS screen. I love the fact that it's in 4:3 format as well, you know, because a lot of the classic games were. But also it's got a thing called Tate mode in there as well, because there are some really nice shooters on here on the Evercade. And obviously a lot of those kind of classic shoot 'em up games, they had vertical displays in the arcade, didn't they? Yeah. So actually you can rotate it 90 degrees and play them vertically on the screen.
That reminds me of the Lynx, like that kind of thing.
I thought of the Lynx as well, but I think that's really cool.
I think the IPS screen's really important, actually, because, you know, being able to view it from all angles, especially if it's a portable one and you're playing it in some odd position or something, you know, I think that's really good to actually have that. And OLED, if it was OLED, it would be very expensive, wouldn't it? So I can understand doing it in the IPS vibes.
I think IPS is, for a screen that size, it's only 4.3 inches. I think, that's more than good enough for that.
For sure.
And it's got stuff you expect on there today, USB-C, built-in Wi-Fi to it as well. Although this is actually the first Evercade that they've preloaded games onto the actual device as well. Every Evercade EXP is going to be preloaded with 18 classic Capcom games as well. And this is actually the first time that these Capcom games have been featured on the Evercade. And there are some incredible ones on here as well. 18 of their best arcade titles.
Yeah, I thought this was really cool. So there hasn't been any Capcom games whatsoever on the Evercade yet. They haven't done a Capcom cartridge or anything like that. So like you say, there's 18 games on this, and it's 14 arcade versions. So you get 14 arcade games, and then you get 4 console games. So the 4 console games are Mega Man, Mega Man 2, Mega Man X, and Breath of Fire, which I think are really, really, really solid games. And then the arcade games that you get, which will probably be taking advantage of that tape mode, as 1942, 1943, 1944.
They're great games, but so
really,
hard.
really good games. Yeah, very hard though. It's a good job you get unlimited credits on these things usually.
Yeah.
So, but some really awesome games on there. You got Bionic Commando, Captain Commando as well. Commando, one of my favorites, Final Fight, Forgotten Worlds, Ghouls and Ghosts. Hopefully,
speaking of needing continues.
Yeah, I was going to say, speaking of needing continues, hopefully they're unlimited in there. Legendary Wings, Mercs, Street Fighter 2, Hyper Fighting, Strider, and
what was Hyper Fighting? Was that Turbo?
That was the I'm pretty sure that was the last Street Fighter 2 arcade game that came out. It came out at the back end of 1994,
right.
And it was the one. It was made on. I could be wrong here, but I'm pretty sure it was made on the newer arcade board, and it was the one where it was like it had all the bosses, all the extra characters, like T-Hawk and DJ, and then it had the nicer sprites, and it was the turbo free it could go up to as well. Mm-hmm. So it's like the final version, the definitive version of Street Fighter 2 Hyper Fighting.
Yeah, it's on the 30th anniversary collection as well.
Yeah. And then you get Strider and Vulgus on there as well. So really, really solid library there. And the fact that it comes built in, I think is absolutely fantastic. Pre-orders started this week, and we're expecting it on November 24th. 2022,
and I think the price point's quite good as well. So it's at the moment it's $129.99 UK, and that's a little bit cheaper than the Switch Lite actually. Yeah, it's pretty decent. I like like you said, I like the idea of it having built-in games because you can have those built-in ones, then you can get your cart and put it on top of that and like change around stuff. And also, I think it probably will open the world of hackability as well.
First thing Ravi thinks about whenever we see any new hardware. Hack this thing. Very cool. Then it just again, I mean, we've done episodes about the Evercade before, and it's just a platform and a company that just really love this stuff, and they put a lot of love and effort into it, and you can really tell. I mean, it just oozes quality, and the fact that they're continuing to make it, and they can survive. A company that are dedicated to making these incredible retro collections that have been going now for a good few years, and people love the hardware. So I think it's very cool. So it's nice to see them getting new revisions and new hardware coming out from the Evercade crew. Pre-orders for that available now, and I'll put a link in our show notes at theretrohour.com. Now, you've been to Japan, Joe, and I'd like to think that Japan is generally regarded as a country that's very forward-looking and technologically advanced.
Yeah, it was. It was like a completely different world. It was the future.
Robots walking the streets.
Yeah. I felt like I'd stepped into the future, but I feel like I know where you're going with this. So I met up with with a friend who lives in Japan. He's got his own bar and stuff. And when we met up with him, my wife pointed out when we were going around a lot of the markets that there was a lot of like landline phones and like fax machines and stuff, like shops repairing them, like fax machine repair shops and old house phone repair shops and stuff. And my friend was like, oh yeah, he said, although Japan are really futuristic, they're very savvy in the fact that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And in that regards, they continue to use a lot of old technology, or they will just keep using something, until it does finally give up the ghost. People will have a fax machine and everybody will still fax each other, or a family will have a house phone, and rather than buying a new one or just using their mobile phones, they will get it repaired because people still use landlines. So although it was really futuristic, there's that kind of like recyclable lifestyle as well. But I'm not too sure about this next.
Well, they only turned off their pager service apparently in 2019.
Yeah. So, but I'm not too sure where they're going with the old floppy disks here. So tell me about this.
To me, this seems like a governmental thing. So they've declared war on obsolete media. But before we read this story, we need to talk about one other, which is Japan's cybersecurity minister. This was in 2018. Announced he'd never used a computer.
Oh, wow.
So
Qualified for the job.
Yeah, exactly. And he said, "Oh, that won't affect any of the positions." So I think this is maybe a kind of thing coming down from uninformed people in the top. But they're basically saying that they're declaring war on old media, which includes CD. One which really frustrates me, mini discs.
Oh, you love your mini discs.
So essentially going completely against everything I just said.
And floppy disks, yeah.
Well, this is a new appointment, a guy called Taro Kono, who's been appointed as Japan's digital minister. And this story was submitted on our Discord. Thank you, Destroy007, who sent this over. And it turns out that apparently there are still around almost 2,000 government procedures that still mean they have to use storage medium like floppy disk to do it on because of bureaucracy, really. And I guess there might be a bit of security in there as well, that maybe they kind of fear doing some of this stuff on internet-connected devices. But it turns out now a lot of floppy disks are still in use in Japan, but they're saying that they want to kind of drag countries' bureaucrats into the 21st century and finally abolish them by the looks of it.
It's scary because I think there's a really big argument about having computers that are running stuff like infrastructure, nuclear missiles, stuff like that offline and having no connection with it. Maybe not have them running on floppy disks, but CDs at least would be a good idea for backing up. They don't mention DVDs and stuff, so maybe they're all right with that. But it also seems like there was a case where two ministers left, two members of Tokyo Police Force lost 2 floppy disks containing information on 38 housing applicants. So I think the problem is with the Tokyo Police Force, not with the format there. And it might be kind of taking the blame for the mad stuff that's happened. But in
2022, it's easy. Every government in the world has got their own kind of private cloud storage where they do stuff on that, is not accessible from the outside, and two-factor authentication, all that kind of stuff. It's just surprising that in Japan, I imagine these rules were probably written decades ago and they've just never updated them.
Yeah, well, we covered a story which was in 2014, which was about floppy disks not being used at the stop being used at the military facility for nuclear weapons in America for nuclear weapons. But these weren't like 3.5-inch floppies. These were the old floppies, the big ones. Yeah. And that was from the 70s. Kind of leftover stuff from that. Yeah, it's interesting. I said in a comment on this on RMC actually had shared it as well, and I said we should make ninja stars out of the floppies and fight back, make sure that they're kind of reinstated. And if they're getting rid of mini discs, send them all to me, please. Yeah.
Ravi, actually, you've stopped using your phone for like Spotify and that. You've actually gone old school again this week.
Mate, I've gone down the mini disc rabbit hole. So like Spotify and stuff, all the music was limited, and I've got my old mini disc player out, and one battery will last me like 54 hours of continuous play from 1AA, and it's quite good quality. I've been going around listening to my mini disc. It's quite big, of course. I've got NetMD working, and I've gone on all these mini disc like groups on Facebook, and people are like really into it. I saw a guy like head to toe in mini disc branded clothes and stuff. So yeah, another rabbit hole for me to go down.
So next time we see you, you're going to be wearing a mini disc shell suit or something.
I'm going to record the retro hour on a mini disc. That's the way to go.
So, I mean, that is one thing about Japan kind of declaring the end of floppy disks. I imagine that might mean it could go either way. Maybe there's going to be a lot more floppy disks kind of available. Because I know that Sony stopped making them, didn't they, around... We covered it on the news in an early episode around 2016, I want to say.
Yeah, maybe the government's been hoarding loads of floppy disks and they'll get released, new old stock. Or maybe they're going to have a mass old media burning.
That's the thing. They'll throw them all out.
That would be awful, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it wouldn't be good for security if they suddenly put them all on eBay. I imagine with all the government secrets on there. So I'm just being a bit optimistic there. But there you go. Rest in peace to the floppy disk in Japan. Now, before we get into our chat with this week's very special guest, Michael Case is coming up in just a moment. Let's give some love to our incredible friends at Bitmap Books. Now, of course, we love Bitmap Books, and they have supported the Retro Hour for many years now. We love Sam and the team there. And one of their books, actually, I'm a huge fan of. I love their pixel books that they do. Now, this one is called the SNES or the SNES Pixel Book, and this is a celebration over 272 pages of the golden age of 16-bit Nintendo gaming. And we've all got Bitmap books in our collections, and they're just a work of art, aren't they?
They're gorgeous. Like, I love the sleeves that they have in there as well, but also like the quality of the screenshots and the prints are just unbelievable in Bitmap Books games. I really love them. They're an ideal accompaniment to have if you're just, sipping a tea or having your coffee and you just want to check out some of the older systems.
And the amount of work that goes into these as well, obviously, the Super Nintendo had a massive portfolio of games on there, and they've got tens of thousands of screenshots, not just generic ones, though, ones that were specifically taken, they've been composed, and you know how nice they make the screenshots look on the pages too. And it covers, some incredible games on there, including obscure things, the big classics that you played back in the day, Street Fighter 2, Super Mario World, Super Castlevania 4, Axe Play, all on here as well. They put them all into genre, and there's also, as well as the images, you get really thoughtful and fascinating insights into the design of the games as well, and also how they impacted modern gaming too. So if you want to get hold of this book, it is a must-read for Super Nintendo fans, and you can get it right now and check out the rest of their retro gaming books. All the details are on their website at bitmapbooks.com. Now, while we're talking about good reading material, can I just give a quick mention as well to Ryan Berger, who's a long-time supporter of the Retro Hour. You might have heard about Old School Gamer magazine, which was, it's been a free magazine that he's been doing for about 5 years with a free issue, and that you can download every couple of months to bring it out, but they do a paid-for version as well. And actually, he's got a Kickstarter running at the moment because they really want to take this incredible multi-plat retro gaming magazine to the next level. So if you want to support that, Old School Gamer magazine is the final weekend of that running on Kickstarter, so you'll have to be quick if you want to jump on that, but I'll put a link to that in our show notes at theretrohour.com. Good luck with that, Ryan and the crew. Right, next, we're going to be getting some stories about classics like Metal Gear Solid and Oddworld and bringing those games to the PC with our special guest, Michael Case, is next on the Retro Hour podcast.
You're listening to the Retro Hour, and we're chatting to Michael Case about porting PlayStation games to the PC. Now, Michael, how you doing?
Doing great.
So what got you into programming then, and what were the kind of influential games that you played?
What got me into programming? Let's see. I guess, man, I don't know if he was from the CIA or from wherever, who came into my classroom when I was in junior high school and told me that computer programmers going to be the highest, being a computer programmer was going to be the highest paid profession in the United States. And that's literally the way he put it. I was like, sign me up. And they had I guess it would basically be described as a teletype computer at our school in junior high. This was, I would say, 1973 and way back. And basically, we were connected to one computer. This was PDP-11, I think was the term for it. And we would just connect to it via teletype. And the first game that I programmed was a Star Trek game, which basically was a bunch of dots. It was printed out in kind of like a dot matrix. And they would show the Star Trek ship, and as well as a Klingon ship, and you would try to kill the Klingon ship. And the Klingon ship was basically, some letter on the keyboard represented by that, and the starship was represented by another letter. And the computer game was stored on paper tape, which was printed out, something on the side of the teletype. And we quickly figured out how to hack that. So we put a little fake hanging piece of tape out of the side. So when the teacher logged us in, she wouldn't realize that we'd redirected the paper tape that was being printed by her logging in to go below that, basically, out of the side. So she wouldn't see it. We then took that piece of paper and decoded it and got the login for our school, and traded that with the other schools in our local district. And by doing that, we connected with some people at USC and, a bunch of other people at other universities. And they were all hackers at that point. They all had, one guy we met had 30, it seemed like 30 phones in his dorm room. And he was using them all to, do hacking on, various computers. I don't know if he was, hacking the, government agencies or whatever. But at any rate, we exchanged, our passwords that we had found out, and we were children who were, at that point, I'd say 16. And we got access to the USC computers. And then we went down there, and with our accounts, we're able to, access more powerful computers, et cetera, So that's how I got into computer programming, to make a long story short, or to make a short story long.
Well, did that then kind of lead to you studying it more and getting a wider understanding of computing?
Oh, yeah. And then I entered a computer competition at USC and University of Southern California. I won the competition, even though I wasn't a student at the University of Southern California. I was just a high school kid, So.
And did you kind of think this could be? Did you believe the guy and think this could be a viable career for the future, or were you just kind of playing around then?
Well, I just found I was good at it, and why not? It's just going to be a viable occupation, certainly.
So we read that you got your start with a company called Multivision, who were a adult games company. Did any of the games sell well? Did any of the games sell well, and what's the story there?
No, the games never sold. They never went to market.
Okay.
Okay, the story, oh boy, geez. That's a really long story. I'll try to make it short. Okay, so basically, let's just talk about the company first.
Yeah.
The company was started by a guy, Eugene Finke, who was an adult photographer that had worked for a variety of magazines like Playboy, etc. Basically photographing nude women, and he had that entree into the adult market. So he used that to convince a guy who was I'm trying to remember he was a physician, I think a dermatologist, I want to say, to give him some seed money to try to do a video game, because video games were the hottest thing at that point. That was during the point of the Atari 2600s. The Atari 2600, of course,
yeah,
you guys.
Yeah.
The height of its career, we can say. And he had this full plan for a media campaign, etc. This was, I guess, basically sold by Eugene to this dermatologist, because Custer's Revenge was a game that was being done at that point. I'm sure everybody knows about Custer's Revenge.
Yeah.
And so he wanted to make more classy adult games, appealing more to men and women. At that point, there was no way to program the Atari 2600. There was no instruction manual. I basically had to reverse engineer, the entire platform from scratch. I made a wire board for a Apple II that would allow me to connect to it, and basically figured out all the instructions just by trial and error. Because at that point, Nintendo completely controlled that market, and they would give their information to nobody but the people that were doing authorized games.
I guess they didn't really want adult developers on the system, probably, so they wouldn't provide you with any information or any development material.
Of course. Yeah. I mean, that was completely antithetical to their market. They came up with this idea of an adult game that would it was pretty funny, actually. It was supposed to be kind of classy, because you would interact with female characters and pleasure them by moving your remote control joystick in rhythm with the movement of their hips. So you had to kind of like rock your joystick. If you can imagine that.
Yeah.
To the movement on the screen. At any rate, and then once you got by one, but you couldn't stay there too long, because everyone had a danger involved with them. One was succumbing to passion. The husband comes home, kind of thing. There was another one was a snake pit. You fell into a snake pit, and anyway,
they were very kind of weird, those titles for the 2600. I remember a Soft Porn Adventure was one from Sierra as well that was out at the time, and it was it was for the Atari 8-bits, which was they were called Online System at the time. But yeah, there was some really weird like themes and stuff in there, like snake pits and husbands chasing you. Yeah.
Oh yeah, the snake pit one. What was that? That was a very famous game. Can't remember the title. But that was the first one that has sound. That had a real good theme, sound background. They figured out how to do that, because basically on the 2600, the big problem was you had like one oscillator. Just it was like a mono synthesizer. So you had like one note. You could basically play at a time. And they figured out how to modulate it in such a way that you could create a theme, basically. Change it once every 1/40,000th of a second, I guess you could call it, to create a theme.
Yeah.
Activision did that game. What was that game called? I think it was an Indiana Jones game. That was a big breakthrough on the 2600.
Yeah.
And at any rate, I don't know how much more you want me to say about the adult game, but that just quickly degenerated into a situation where the principals involved in the company wanted to kill each other.
Yeah.
Basically, the guy, Eugene Finke, did, just spent a ton of money, did photo shoots that were in Playgirl magazine, etc.
Yeah.
He had a car phone at that point, which was like a big deal. That was before cell phones. So they had car phones. And he basically blew all this guy's money. And the guy didn't have any money left. And, it was like, how are we going to release this game? Atari won't let us release it. And, and then there was this one CES. That was back when, before E3, when all games were released at CES. At the CES show, there was an attempt to steal the source code of the game from my room, literally.
Oh, wow.
By the other principal in the company. And my apartment had been broken into to try to steal it because I was the only person who had the source code. It just got completely crazy. And then they messed around with Eugene's car and broke down in the middle of the Las Vegas desert.
Oh, God, it sounds like the maddest company ever. Did you ever end up getting paid from any of it?
They paid me for a while. Although I remember one of my checks, I had to go to the bank with it immediately because I knew I wasn't going to get paid because the bank account's almost empty. So I went to the bank and there was Eugene in the line in front of me, waiting for his paycheck to be paid. And he mysteriously disappeared. And people have asked me about him over the years. It's like, what happened to this guy? And it's like, I have no idea, and there's like no internet history of him. Although he was apparently a famous adult photographer at one point. There's some evidence of him on the internet, but I mean, very little. And that's extremely unusual for any person. So, I don't know. I don't know what happened to him. I don't know if he was killed.
Could be living in
we're
Cuba.
talking about it. I mean, the other people in the company were talking about it. I mean, that's how crazy it got. I mean, at one point, I was driving down Sunset Boulevard in Los Angeles, and the attorney for the company pulled up next to me, just a completely random scenario. And he was just like, I'm so wasted on Quaaludes, dude. Can I just crash out your pad? That's literally what he said to me.
The attorney.
And I was like, no, I got something I had to do. Yeah.
Oh man, that's crazy.
So and that was the attorney for the company.
yeah. That's oh wow. Well, it sounds a bit Wolf of Wall Street. So after that, you ended up with Western Technology. Was it good to get out of the adult niche and kind of get on with programming and stuff, like actually getting games out?
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, I didn't. That was like when I did this. I figured out a way to program the Atari 2600, because the Atari 2600 had a very unusual graphics system. It basically had no graphics memory. So you would have to just, in real time, draw each line on the screen. Would be the best way to put it. Well, there was a buffer. There was a small buffer that allowed you to write the bits, whatever color you wanted for every pixel into every for that line of the screen in real time. So it had to be that fast. You had to, there was the program would have to be incredibly fast. You could waste no computer cycles.
Yeah.
The only time that you could waste computer cycles was in the vertical retrace before it redrew the entire screen. And there was, I don't know, what would that be? Probably a fifth of the time to do all your computation for, whatever was happening in the game. Mm-hmm. So whether that be, figuring out what you were going to do next, setting up all the sound, setting up all the graphics, etc., for what you were going to draw next. And so basically there was no way to do anything. It was like 3D. And I figured out a way to do 3D on the 2600. And it was crude 3D, but it was for a game that we were actually doing for Atari. It was for the Andro Man.
Yeah, that was one of the brains on board kind of robots, wasn't it? It was it Nolan Bushnell who started like an offshoot or was working with them? And
Nolan Bushnell did the Atari 2600 to begin with.
Yeah, and I remember there was a lot of kind of different types of bots, and Andro Man was one of them. They were like educational, personal robots. I've never seen one in action. How did they actually work?
Well, they were never released to the public. No game was released with, I believe, maybe one with the Androbot. Basically, the way it was supposed to work was that you would have a fold-out playboard, like a
laminate, like a plastic sheet, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. And there were certain spots on the sheet that the with a barcode, literally, that the robot would roll over. And as soon as it rolled over it, then it would know where the robot was on the sheet. And using that, it would interface with the video on the screen to, let you know where you were on the map, and it would do something depending on the game. One game was a clue game, like, the mystery game Clue. One of my friends at the company did, and he actually completed that one. I did Androman on the Moon, where I think I called him Androman, Androbot, something like that. And he was exploring the moon. And, so basically what happened was every time you went over a different barcode, it would bring up a different graphic on the screen, and you would go into a different screen experience. And then you play a game on the screen, and then you go to a different, spot and scan a different barcode. And then that would, basically go into a different game. And so one of them was 3D, where you'd go like down this tunnel and you'd be shooting at things flying at you. And another one, it was basically kind of a rip-off of a video game that was in arcades at that point, where you were shooting at towers. It was it was Star Wars, basically.
Yeah.
So we did that, and that looked 3D too. So that was a game that I worked on for them. But it was never released because it's 2600, exploded with the imploded, I should say, with the ET game, which was buried in the desert in Southern California, Arizona. I'm sure you know about that story.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. We've had the developer Howard Scott Warshaw on, actually.
Oh, cool.
And it was really interesting to hear about that. Like with the video games crash.
They dug him up.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, Atari Game Over was the documentary.
Right. It was a documentary.
I was wondering how that affected things then for you personally, like the video games crash.
Let's see. Well, I got out of doing video games, and our company, Western Technologies, went into. Gee, would I be giving away something that's top secret?
We could always
ever heard of a Sonoboy?
A what? A solo?
Sonoboy.
Sonoboy. No.
It was basically they put him in the North Atlantic.
Yeah.
And around the Arctic, and they were supposed to pick up signals from Soviet subs.
Oh, okay.
Something for that. The cool thing about it was a 1-bit computer that was on the Sonoboy, which basically floated and picked up sounds. And I'm sorry, a 4-bit computer. I shouldn't have said 1-bit. 4-bit. That was what was unusual about it, because the only 4-bit computer I think ever existed. And it had an instruction that you could send to it that would basically it had some output ports, that for output that you could control. And, because it was a computer as well as it was a computer chip that also had outputs. Let me put it that way.
Yeah.
And one of the output pins, I should call them, would destroy the device. So I had to write a computer program that, after it did all this stuff, picking up all the signals from the device, would destroy the device by putting the death code basically to this one. One pin.
Mission Impossible, basically. In Mission Impossible, they have this tape will self-destruct. I guess it was that kind of thing.
Exactly. Sorry, I didn't put it that way, but
So at this point, you've gone from making adult games for the Atari to making robots for the Atari to making essentially computers in Buoyancy Boys, and then you moved to Malibu Interactive. How did that work? How did you get your work there?
Well, actually, Malibu Interactive started out as an adult company.
Oh wow!
Don't they all?
They had a whole line of comic books, and a lot of them were adult comic books.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how they got all their money to begin with. And they decided to get into video games because, of course, at that point, everybody wanted to get into video games. But that lasted for a pretty short period because they basically ran out of money. And that was kind of a short career there. I don't know, 6 months, something like that. Didn't really work on any games that were ever released there. That's, a very common thing in the video game industry, as you know. Games, or at least at that point, games that were never released, because everybody wanted to get into it. It was like, it's like making a ton of money. You got to get into it,
Yeah.
Basically, at that point, I was trying to, develop my own software to try to create my own company, which I eventually did. Mm. And so, we did a BattleTech game. I'm sorry.
I was going to ask about BattleTech. Like, it seemed quite
so many years ago.
Yeah, it seemed like quite an interesting game. It was a bit like one of the Strike games, like Desert Strike.
Exactly, and, it was Desert Strike revisited
with a mech, basically.
Yeah. That was exactly what they said. It's like Desert Strike is a really cool game, and it was. I mean, it just was. Had some excellent strategy elements to it, every game is a reinvention of another game, So I wouldn't say they ripped it off, just kind of were inspired by it. Yeah, had some great graphics. We worked with some great artists there, and a very interesting guy worked on it with me, Mick West. I don't know if you ever talked to him.
No, we haven't actually.
Well, you should. He's a Brit. He lives in the U.S., but he's the world's expert on UFO debunking and other debunking issues, especially jet contrails. Just type in jet contrails Mick West, and you'll find out all about him.
And he was at Neversoft as well. I'm just
He made millions at Neversoft. Because what happened was Neversoft was lucky enough to do the Spider-Man game after, and I will sound a bit bitter now because my company was going on at the same time as theirs, my company Digital Dialect, and we had a superior 3D engine. However, basically after they completely blew one game for Sony, they were able to get the contract to use that same engine they developed for the previous game to do Spider-Man. And nobody thought Spider-Man was going to be anything. As in the media, the film world, they didn't think Spider-Man was going to do anything, but it did. So as a result, their game did really well.
Yeah.
And they just kind of happened to be in the right place at the right time, and they made millions off of it, and as a result became darlings of Sony, and went on to do a bunch of other Spider-Man 2, 3, 4, and a number of other games, and he became a multimillionaire. And so as a result, Mick West is now the world's expert on jet contrails.
Yeah, they did the Tony Hawk's games as well, didn't they? Which were
they did,
yeah, which were like the biggest games in the world at the time. So it did all right.
It did very well. Yes.
So let's talk about your company then. So the industry was changing. Obviously, CD-ROMs and the PlayStation was coming. This was the next thing. What kind of games were you guys working on? Were you working? You got Battle Arena to Shinden here?
Yeah. That was. A conversion from the PS1 to the PS to the PC.
Yeah.
So we kind of got known for doing conversions, and that was primarily what we did for many years. Although I wrote many video game treatments, took them around to many video game producers, all with NDAs, and some of them were ripped off. I would say. I don't know. Well, like you said, you won't release anything to the legal world. So I remember doing a bunch of World War II games because I'm kind of a World War II buff. And I was like, behind enemy lines, So you do this 3D game, and we had a 3D engine. We actually had the best. Oh, let me just back up a little bit first. We did like first a game for Time Warner Interactive, which was a 3D game that was kind of like a James Bond type game where you would, basically be a secret agent. And we recreated the entirety of Venice, Italy, using maps, etc. And there was one point in the game where you would like literally go on this like high speed race through Venice, Italy. And I mean, for the time, on a PC, it was pretty cutting edge. But, the company went out of business, basically. They decided to cut that whole division. We aren't going to do video games because, it was all a result of, the collapse of 2600. And then, PC games came in, and then they kind of just didn't do too well. Some of them did, some of them didn't, but they decided they didn't want to do that, be in that business. They wanted to be into multimedia, which that was basically the idea that people would want to buy CD-ROMs and put them in their computers and basically have audio and video experience of encyclopedia type of thing about, any subject you'd want. But then the internet suddenly arrived. And internet browsers, and all of a sudden all the information you'd ever want in the world was on the internet. And so there was no reason to have those. So that was a brief phase that our company went through also. But I don't know. So anyway, so we, did that, did a video game for them. And so we had a 3D engine as a bottom line that was, pretty much cutting edge. I remember literally, and here's an interesting thing. You might want to not cut this out. There was, at that point, they would have meetups for people who were doing video games in Los Angeles. And I went to one of them with our video game that had the entire drive your boat, your high-speed boat through Venice, through the canals. And everybody was like, oh, my God, look at that. And everybody was like congregating around our computer. And right next to us was the company, you'll know the name of the company, but Warcraft. I won't say the name. It was doing Warcraft at that point.
Yeah.
And, with a bunch of little goblins running around the screen in 2D.
Yeah.
Right next to us. And nobody looked at their screen. And then years later, I was like, oh, my God.
I was going to say, like, I was going to say, like, Battle Arena to Shinden, like, really pushed those polygonal characters and stuff, and it was still MS-DOS. So, did that like require a graphics card and a bit of grunt on your machine to get it running?
Well, I don't know exactly what you're asking. Do you mean did it require a lot on the user's machine?
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, with the extra adaption of graphics cards and people start buying them, did that make like developing these 3D titles and running this 3D engine easier?
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, it certainly made it easier. I mean, that they wouldn't have happened if, those cards hadn't been around. And everything was going 3D at that point because we had this 3D engine. Yeah, that made it easy. And we did, push as many polygons as we could. But, it was, I believe there were several different levels that you could adjust the game to, depending on your the graphics capabilities of your computer. One that would run just like on a regular computer, a regular PC, and one that would run on one with like an NVIDIA card or something like that.
I guess that's always the difference with a PC, that you have to kind of hit all of the consumers that have all the different setups and be able to run it in low settings as well as high. Yeah.
Always a pain in the ass. And, that, of course, in addition to ability performance of the graphics on the computer, you also have to deal with, crashes on various computers, because the testing requirements were like very intensive, and they always have been on the PC, and they still are. I mean, you can see people making complaints all the time on Microsoft forums, et cetera, about their Microsoft games. It crashed on my computer, it happens all the time. And when we did Metal Gear Solid, we did for Microsoft, and they had an incredible testing team. They were running like, I don't know, 400 computers.
Oh, wow.
People running on computers every day, on, with every variety of configuration, every variety of graphics card, and there were so many graphics cards at that point. It was ridiculous. It's like, well, it crashed on this Multivision, was Multivision out of the picture at that point? I forget. Card.
So there would be those 400 computers running, and then a couple of them would come to you and say it crashed on this setup and it crashed on that setup, and then I guess you and your team would then have to work out to stop that crash from happening, just in case if a consumer has that setup, I'm guessing.
Exactly. And so what we had to do at one point was send one of our programmers over there to work on it with them, in their test lab on the actual computers. He was the guy who wrote a lot of the code. Malkia, he was this Bulgarian guy, and he ended up getting hired away from me by Microsoft because he was against his NDA. But who am I against Microsoft? I didn't say that. Allegedly.
So speaking of all these different developers and Microsoft and stuff, what was it like working with all these big different companies? PlayStation. Was there really strict requirements for the ports and what you guys were working on?
Strict requirements? Nah, I wouldn't say so. I mean, it was, well, if you run those games today, they won't run on a computer. Unfortunately, they changed DirectX. We always use DirectX, the Microsoft product, and we used it in the proper way, and they won't run anymore. So you have to get a vintage computer if you want to run any of our games.
So Abe's Odyssey Oddworld was one of the biggest selling games for the PS1 at the time. Was there a lot of requirements to match the PS1 version when porting that?
The people at Oddworld were very easy to work with, and they gave us great access to all their content. So it was very easy to do the conversion, and we were able to talk to their programmers, etc. So basically it was all written in C programming language. So, we just had to convert to C so that it would run on the PC. Not too much of a problem. I mean, the graphics pipeline, there was, some issues with that, just converting them to the format that we needed to use on the PC. But it was pretty easy. It was a pretty smooth experience. And, the game was very well written. The programmers did a good job on it. So, it ran very well on the PC. So I wouldn't say there were any problems. We did have to do a number of foreign versions in different languages. And here's the fun fact that when we did the Japanese version, they realized at Oddworld that they had to completely redo all the graphics on Abe because he had 4 fingers. And 4 fingers are considered naughty. How would you put it?
Yeah.
Japan, because of the Yakuza, because they chop people's pinkies off in the Yakuza.
Yeah.
So they had to make him have 3 fingers. So they had to redo all the graphics. And it took like 2 weeks running all that stuff through the Silicon graphics machines that they had to, redo every image of Abe with 3 fingers.
Oh, wow. So you mentioned, obviously, that you ported the Metal Gear Solid port from PlayStation to PC. And obviously, such a huge game, probably the biggest game in the world around 99, 2000 when it came out. What was that like? And was there a lot of pressure there? You mentioned there was the 400 PCs testing the game and stuff. What was the experience like?
The fun fact about that was we showed it at E3 because Microsoft was actually behind it, although it was actually released by Konami. Mm-hmm. That was the name that was stamped on it.
Yeah.
On outside the box, and not the name of our company, although it was in the contract that we had with Microsoft that our name had to be on the package.
And they didn't do it.
But they didn't do it, and what am I going to sue Microsoft? But it was, if you watch the game, it's in the credits.
Yeah.
But so that was okay with me, I guess. But the fun fact was that in the original Metal Gear Solid game on the PS1, Solid Snake, the main character, and as well as all the other characters in the game, had basically black holes for their eyes.
Yeah.
And so it's like, well, when you do it on the PC, you're going to have much higher resolution. So, do proper faces. So I had my artists do, really nice looking faces for them. And, great, nothing offensive about them. And we showed them off at, it was, I forget if that was after the CES or I think it was E3 at that point. It was E3 at that point. And it was shown there and, oh God, I'm trying to remember his name. Kojima, I think.
Hideo Kojima. Yeah.
Yeah. He saw it and he was just like enraged. This looks too good. This is going to make our game look bad. You must make their eyes. So we had to basically reduce the resolution of all the faces. The rest of the game we were able to keep it high res, but the faces had to have blurred eyes, even though there was no reason for it. They could have looked like proper people's faces.
It's interesting as well because of in the codec, the parts of the game when they're talking, on their headsets and stuff, they have, animated. There's an animation to them, like an anime style. So I would imagine your artists would have based them on those characters, what they look like in that situation. So maybe
we just used the original graphics from that. We didn't change them.
Yeah, so maybe he was upset because you made it look better than his version.
Not that part. No, not that part. Just the in the game.
Yeah.
When you'd see close-ups of them. And actually, here's another fun fact. There was actually a porno scene in it. It was an Easter egg. You had to type in some. I don't remember what the code was, but where Solid Snake got naked with the female character in the game.
Oh, really?
In a locker room.
And was that in the PS? That was hidden in the PS1 version, was it?
I believe it was, yes.
Because I know
it was our version. It was the original source code that we were working from.
Oh wow! Because I know there's if you're quick enough, you can catch her in her pants and stuff like that. Like looking at her through the vents. If you do a particular part in the game quick enough, she won't get changed quick enough out of like the uniform she's in. So yeah, maybe it's a longer version of that we didn't get to see.
Yeah, and
One thing I was wondering as well was there an effect of like piracy on the PC sales at all, and were many of the games pirated?
Well, I would assume so. Yeah, I mean, like any PC game, even today. I mean, I went to Russia once, and we were walking through the subways, stations, and here was the latest game that was out on the PC. I won't say which, and it was selling for $2 or something. So yes, that's long been a problem around the world, but I don't know how it affected the sales. Any games I worked on, I doubt they would have, because they were games that were just done for the PC, and none of them had very high sales. I'd say the Metal Gear Solid was probably the highest selling one.
Yeah,
except for I'm trying to think what one. Well, certainly not the original one we did, Adrenix.
we never managed.
Known game.
Yeah, how was Adrenix? What was that like? Because we never managed to get that one in there. What was that like?
Oh, a nightmare. Basically, it was just a game where you had complete 360-degree movement in the game. And,
and you flew like a spacecraft, didn't you?
Yeah, and I had a whole treatment I wrote for it. It was originally called Freelancer, and then we worked with Playmates Interactive on that one. Oddly named company. I think they were from Taiwan, I believe. basically they assigned a producer to the game, and he completely rewrote the game and made it a game based around this drug, Adrenix.
Yeah.
And that wasn't what the original concept of the game was. It was just, we wanted to do a game that, had that kind of freedom of movement, because that was something that was in very few games at that point. That was around the time of, it was past Wolfenstein. What's the next level after that? I want to say Quake, but it wasn't.
Doom,
yeah, Doom. That was when Doom level games were around. But, Doom didn't have, full 360-degree movement. It was all, you just had to walk around a kind of semi-2D world with some 3D elements. But this was like complete 3D movement, So we did have an engine, what we called Cancun, that we actually sold to some other companies that developed games with it. But unfortunately, none of those games were ever made it to were ever sold to publishers, or were released by publishers, I should say. But were used by a variety of companies around the world because we had very low license fees. So yeah, with that game, the best part of the game is the cutscene at the beginning. You can look it up on the internet. It's friggin' hilarious. Look up Adrenix cutscene. I don't know if you've ever seen.
I'll have to look it up after, because it's out of all the games we spoke about, it's the only one I've not played. Obviously, other than the adult ones for the 2600. So, was there any titles you would have loved to have port that you never got the contract on, or anything you just missed out on? Like the Spider-Man game, unfortunately. Well,
yeah, I definitely wanted to move out of the whole arena of porting games. That's why I wrote up a bunch of treatments. And well, basically, I went around to every video game company at one point, and I had treatments for a variety of games. One of my main ones was a World War II game called Behind Enemy Lines, and at that point, I'm trying to remember the exact year, it was around 2000. And every game company gave me the same line: nobody's interested in World War II games. Kids now have no interest in that. They don't know what World War II is. It's kind of like the way people feel about World War I now.
Yeah.
Or maybe before that movie came out. And they just all passed on it, but I had them all sign, non-disclosure agreements. And then Saving Private Ryan came out.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, every game was a World War II game.
Medal of Honor, yeah.
And one of them was called Commandos Behind Enemy Lines. And that was, I won't say which company, but was one of the companies that I have a non-disclosure agreement with that they signed. But they can say, hey, we were working on this game before it, So, well, but I was the originator of the World War II games.
Oh man, it sounds like you had a tough time with people. How do I word it? Not getting to the finishing line first, but just bigger companies coming up with an idea that you've already worked on or something you've already started to put out. Sounds tough.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I'd like to say I was ahead of my time, but we had an engine that was ahead of our time, and some games concepts that were ahead of their time. UFO games, certainly, and one of those too. Well, there was a ton of those. Nobody wanted to do those, but yeah, wrong place, wrong time. Didn't do the Spider-Man game. So now I'm not the world's expert on jet contrail.
Well, Michael, it's been awesome to chat to you, and thanks so much for coming on the show.
Well, thank you too. It was a pleasure.